Grant Ashworth hadn't expected anything good to happen to him in a long while, and most days that was fine. He'd made peace with ordinary. At 38, he ran the last working lobster boat out of Belhaven Harbor that still belonged to a single owner, instead of a company. And he was raising his daughter, Willa, alone on the money that boat brought in. Which wasn't much most seasons, and was less than that this one. Every morning before the sky had fully decided what color it wanted to be, he was down at the wharf, checking his traps, and every evening he was back at the little gray house on Tide Road, making sure Willa had done her reading log and eaten something that wasn't crackers. 3 years now since Marnie died. Cancer had taken 11 months to do it. And in some ways Grant felt like he was still catching his breath from those 11 months. Like a man who'd been held underwater, and had only just now remembered how lungs worked. He didn't talk about it much. In a town like Belhaven, people knew your business, whether you told them or not. And they'd taken to nodding at him a certain way at the co-op or the hardware store, a nod that meant we know, and we're not going to make you talk about it. And Grant was grateful for that, more than he ever said out loud. Willa was 6, going on considerably older some days. She had her mother's stubborn chin and a habit of asking questions Grant didn't have good answers for. Questions like why the herring gulls always won fights with the smaller birds, or whether the boat missed her mom too. He answered what he could and let the rest sit. That was mostly how he ran his whole life now. Answer what you can, let the rest sit, keep the boat running, keep the kid fed. Don't look too far down the road, because the road had a way of surprising you and not in the fun way. The morning it all started, Grant was up to his elbows in the guts of his winch motor, which had seized sometime in the night for no reason he could find. Which was the kind of thing that happened to a boat that was older than he was. He heard the car before he saw it. A low, expensive hum that didn't belong anywhere near a working wharf. The sound of an engine that had never once been asked to do anything difficult. He straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag that made them dirtier instead of cleaner, and watched a black SUV ease down the gravel lane toward the dock like it was afraid of getting its tires scuffed. A woman got out. She wasn't dressed for a fishing town. A charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than his boat's last engine repair. Boots that had clearly never touched salt water. Hair pulled back so neat it looked like it had been done by somebody whose whole job was making hair look like that. Grant knew who she was before she said a word, because everybody in 3 counties knew the Whitcomb name. Whitcomb Maritime ran half the shipping contracts on this coast, and its CEO's face had been in the regional business paper often enough that even a man who didn't read the business paper had seen it. You're Grant Ashworth, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Depends who's asking. He wasn't trying to be difficult. It just came out that way, the way things did when a man had been up since 5 wrestling with a dead winch. Isla Whitcomb. She said it like she expected the name to do some work for her, and it did, though not the work she might have hoped. Grant just kept looking at her, waiting. She glanced toward the boat, toward the peeling paint on the wheelhouse, toward the general condition of a man who had clearly not slept enough or eaten enough that week, and something in her face shifted. Not pity, exactly, more like recalculation. My father sent me, she said. He grew up here. Whitcomb Point actually before it had that name, before it had any name at all really. He heard about your situation from the harbor master. My situation. Your wife, raising your daughter alone, he said. She stopped, seemed to hear how it was going to sound before she said it, and said it anyway because there wasn't really a way around it. He said a man like you shouldn't have to do it by himself. He thinks you need someone. Grant let that sit in the cold morning air for a second. Then he laughed. Not a mean laugh, just the laugh of a tired man hearing something too absurd to take offense at. He thinks I need someone, and that someone is you. Isla's composure cracked just slightly, a flush moving up from her collar. I know how it sounds. I really don't think you do. He set his wrench down on the gunwale and looked at her properly for the first time, taking in the whole strange picture of her. The coat, the boots, the careful hair, all of it standing on a wharf that smelled like diesel and bait. All of it looking wildly out of place and, if he was honest, a little bit brave for staying put instead of retreating to the car. You drove 2 hours from the city to tell a stranger he needs a wife because your dad said so. It's not, she exhaled. It's complicated. My father built half his company on a promise he made himself when he left this town. That if he ever made real money he'd put some of it back where it came from. He doesn't believe in writing checks to strangers. He believes in, I don't know, knowing people. And apparently he decided the way for me to know you was. She gestured vaguely, as if the gesture could explain what words couldn't. This. I told him it was ridiculous. But you came anyway. There's an expansion project. Freight contracts along this whole coast, new cold storage, work for maybe 200 people who don't currently have steady work. I need my father's shares to vote it through the board, and he won't release them unless I do this one thing first. So. She lifted her chin, some of the CEO returning to her voice. Here I am. Grant looked past her, down the length of the wharf, at the other boats tied up for the morning with their crews doing the same slow, aching work he'd been doing his whole adult life. Then he looked at Willa's bicycle, propped against the shed where she'd left it the day before, pink and scuffed and missing one streamer. Something in him that had been braced for an argument relaxed, just a little, into something closer to tired amusement. I don't need a wife, he said. I need this winch to stop being a piece of junk. I need Willa's rain boots to stop being a size too small before I've even paid off the last pair. I need the harbor authority to quit raising the mooring fee every time they redo the parking lot at their office, which I have never once parked in. A wife isn't a part you can order for a boat, Ms. Whitcomb. She's not a fix for anything. Isla stood there a moment, and Grant watched her do something he hadn't expected, actually think about what he'd said. Instead of brushing past it the way he assumed people who ran companies were trained to do. No, she said finally quietly, I don't suppose she is. She should have gotten back in the car right then. Grant fully expected her to. Instead she stood on his wharf for another 20 minutes, asking him about the boat, about the lobster season, about how a winch even worked, and by the time she left, she still hadn't gotten a single thing she'd come for. And neither had he, and somehow that seemed to suit them both fine. She came back the following week. She said it was about the expansion project, that she needed to understand the local fishery before her board presentation. And Grant let her believe he believed that. She came back again a week after that with a folder of maps and shipping lanes. She genuinely did want his opinion on. Because it turned out a man who'd worked this water. His whole life knew things her consultants in the city didn't. And somewhere in there, without either of them quite naming it, the visit stopped needing an excuse. Willa took to her almost instantly. In the unguarded way small children do. The third visit, Isla arrived to find the girl sitting on the porch steps with a bucket of hermit crabs she'd collected, narrating each one's personality in exhaustive detail. And instead of the polite 5 minutes Grant expected from a woman in a $2,000 coat, Isla sat right down on the step, careful boots and all, and asked the crab named Gerald a very serious question about his opinions on the tide. You don't have to do that, Grant told her later, once Willa had been sent in to wash up. Do what? Pretend to care about crab opinions. Isla looked at him with something almost offended. Who says I'm pretending? He didn't have a good answer for that, and he found, standing there in the fading light with the smell of low tide coming up off the flats, that he didn't especially want one. It had been a long time since anyone had made him feel like there was a conversation worth having, that wasn't about bills or bait prices, or which of Willa's shoes needed replacing next. Isla asked him questions nobody else bothered to ask anymore. Not how are you holding up, which people asked when they wanted permission to stop worrying about him, but real questions. About what he'd wanted before the boat, before Marnie got sick, before all of it. He found himself answering honestly, which surprised him more than it should have. For her part, Isla discovered things about herself she hadn't gone looking for. She'd built her whole adult life around the idea that being taken seriously meant never being caught wanting anything simple. She ran board meetings where grown men twice her age deferred to her without argument. She'd closed deals that made the business pages for weeks. And none of it, she was beginning to understand, had ever once made her feel the way she felt, sitting on a splintery porch step, watching a 6-year-old explain crustacean psychology to a woman who owned 3 properties and not one pet. You're different out here, her assistant told her once, back at the office, after Isla had canceled a dinner with a supplier for the 3rd time in a month to drive out to Belhaven instead. Different how? I don't know. Less braced. Like you've stopped waiting for someone to disagree with you. Isla didn't have an answer for that either, and she noticed she was collecting a lot of questions lately that she couldn't answer. And that this, too, was new. It was Willa, in the end, who said the thing that stayed with Isla longest. They were down on the flats one gray afternoon, poking through tide pools while Grant mended a trap up on the beach, and Willa looked up at her with the flat, uncomplicated curiosity only children manage and asked, "How come you never smile in your pictures?" "What pictures?" "The ones in the newspaper my teacher showed the class." "You're always doing the same face." Willa demonstrated, a tight closed mouth expression that was, Isla realized with a small jolt, exactly the face she wore in every photograph anyone had taken of her in a decade. "I suppose nobody's ever asked me to smile in those," Isla said. which was true, and also not really an answer, and Willa seemed to sense that but was kind enough, in the way children sometimes are, to let it go. That question followed Isla home. It followed her into board meetings and quarterly reviews and the too-quiet condo she came back to every night. And somewhere in the following weeks she started to understand that she had built an extraordinarily successful life that had almost nothing in it. She'd choose again if she were starting over. She had the corner office. She had the seat on the industry council. She did not have anyone who would notice, let alone ask if she stopped smiling, closed mouth or otherwise, altogether. Grant, meanwhile, had his own reckoning, quieter and more stubborn. The kind a man has while doing physical work that leaves his hands busy and his mind free to wander places he'd normally keep it from going. He noticed he was listening for her car now on the days she might come. He noticed he'd started fixing up the porch railing, not because it desperately needed it, but because he didn't want her catching a splinter on it. He noticed, with the particular dread of a man who thought he'd shut that door permanently 3 years ago, that he was falling for Isla Whitcomb, and that this terrified him considerably more than any storm he'd ever ridden out on the water. The trouble, when it came from two directions at once, the way trouble in a small town often does. The first was a misunderstanding. And like most misunderstandings, it started with something almost true. Isla's father, Nolan Whitcomb, had been quietly delighted watching his daughter fall for the exact kind of man he'd hoped Belhaven would still produce, and in his delight he made the mistake of saying so, publicly, at a fundraising dinner for the Coastal Economic Council. Something about how his daughter had found real maritime values. Out at the harbor, in front of a reporter who was there covering the expansion announcement, the item ran 2 days later in the business section. A few paragraphs about Whitcomb Maritime's new coastal investment, and a closing line, clearly meant as color, noting that CEO Isla Whitcomb had reportedly found personal inspiration for the project in a Belhaven fisherman. Grant read it standing at the counter of the co-op, where somebody had left the paper open to that page like it was a dare. A Belhaven fisherman. Not his name. Not Willa's name, thank God, but not his either, just a detail, a colorful footnote in a story about Isla's company, about Isla's project, about Isla's life continuing to expand outward while he stood still being useful to it. He didn't say anything to her about it for 4 days, which was itself unlike him, and when he finally did, it came out harder than he meant it to. Am I part of the pitch now? He asked, the next time she came by, before she'd even gotten out of the car properly. Is that what this is? Local color for the shareholders? Isla's face went through several things in quick succession. Confusion, then understanding as he held up the folded paper, then something that looked like genuine hurt. That's not. My father said that, not me. I didn't ask him to. I told him I was furious about it. Doesn't change that it's out there. Doesn't change that half this town's going to be asking me about it at the co-op for the next month. Grant heard himself getting louder than the situation probably called for, and couldn't quite stop. 3 years of being careful, of keeping his head down, of not letting anybody get close enough to make him a story. And here it was anyway, in newsprint whether he'd agreed to it or not. I've spent 3 years making sure Willa's life doesn't get treated like a sad story people feel sorry for. I'm not going to let it get treated like a good one for your board either. I never asked you to be anyone's story, Grant. Didn't have to ask. Just had to be your father's daughter. He regretted it the second it left his mouth, watched it land on her like a slap, and didn't take it back fast enough. Isla didn't shout back. She got very quiet instead, which was somehow worse. I'll tell him to run a correction, she said. I'll tell him to leave your name out of everything, permanently if that's what you want. She paused at her car door. I came out here because I wanted to, Grant. Not because it made a good line in a business article. If you can't tell the difference between those two things, maybe I've been fooling myself about a few other things too. She drove off before he could figure out what to say to that. And Grant stood on the wharf a long time afterward, furious at the article. Furious at himself, and slowly, uncomfortably aware that he'd taken something that scared him and turned it into something he could safely be angry about instead. Because angry was easier than the alternative, which was admitting how much it would cost him if she stopped coming back. She didn't come back the next week. Or the one after. The second piece of trouble arrived without any warning at all. The way real trouble tends to. A November nor'easter blew through harder than the forecast had promised, and Grant lost 2 nights of sleep. Securing what he could and losing what he couldn't. When it cleared, his boat's rudder was cracked clean through. Half his traps were scattered somewhere along 3 miles of coastline. He'd have to search on his own time. And the marine mechanic in town quoted him a repair bill that made his stomach drop clean through the floor. On top of it, the harbor authority chose that same week to send formal notice that his mooring fees were 4 months behind, and that continued non-payment would mean losing his slip. He didn't call anybody. That was Grant's oldest habit. Older than Marnie, older than Willa. The habit of handling things alone, because handling things alone was the one thing he'd always been able to count on himself to do. He started making calls to see what he could sell. He started for the first time since the funeral seriously considering whether the boat that had been in his family 2 generations was a thing he could actually keep. Word travels fast in a town the size of Belhaven, and it reached Isla by way of her father, who still had old contacts at the harbor and who called his daughter, sounding uncharacteristically rattled. "Ashworth's in real trouble," he told her. "I hear he's talking about selling the boat outright." Isla was on the coastal highway within the hour, 3 weeks of silence forgotten, or at least set aside. She found Grant at the wharf in the last gray light of the afternoon, staring at his cracked rudder, like it was a puzzle with no solution. Willa sitting nearby on an overturned bucket, doing her best to look like she wasn't worried. Which was not a look a 6-year-old could manage convincingly. "I heard," Isla said, before he could tell her to leave, "about the storm, the fees. Word travels, let me help, let me cover it. The rudder, the fees, whatever it takes to buy you room to breathe. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, Grant. And you're standing here about to lose the thing your family built because of pride." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face was gentler than his words had been 3 weeks earlier. "I appreciate it. I do. But if I can't hold on to this place myself, it isn't really mine to hold on to anymore. It'd just be yours, with my name still painted on the side." He rubbed a hand over his face, tired in a way that went deeper than the sleepless nights. "That's not pride talking. Or maybe it is, but it's true either way." Isla stood with that for a moment, and instead of arguing, she nodded slowly, because some part of her, the part that had grown up watching her own father, refused the easy fix his entire life, understood exactly what he meant, even if it cost her something to accept it. "Okay," she said. "Not a check then." She was quiet a second, thinking, and Grant watched the CEO surface again behind her eyes. Not cold this time but focused, turning a problem over the way she'd turn over a business decision. "But you're not the only one struggling out here. Half this coast is one bad storm away from what just happened to you. That's not charity, Grant. That's a market nobody's bothered to invest in properly, and I run a company whose entire job is investing in markets." Over the following weeks, instead of solving Grant's problem, Isla solved a larger one, in public, with her board watching. She pushed the coastal expansion through, the cold storage facility, the direct freight contracts that cut out 3 layers of middlemen who'd been squeezing independent boats like Grant's for years, a cooperative buying arrangement that meant 50 small operators along the shore could get parts and fuel at prices that used to be reserved for the big fleets alone. It took months, not days. And it wasn't romantic, and none of it was about Grant specifically. But it meant that by the time his rudder was fixed, paid for the hard way, on a payment plan through the new co-op, same as every other captain, the ground underneath his whole town had shifted into something a little less precarious. Nolan Whitcomb found Grant on the wharf one evening in early spring, months after the storm. The harbor finally busy again with boats, readying for the season. "You know," the older man said, leaning on the rail beside him. "I was right." "About what?" Nolan nodded down the dock, to where Isla stood laughing at something Willa was telling her. The two of them crouched over the same bucket of hermit crabs, Gerald presumably still holding court. "You needed each other. Took the two of you long enough to stop being too stubborn to admit it." Grant watched her a moment, really watched her, the way a man watches something he stopped taking for granted. "Maybe you were," he said finally, and found he meant it all the way down. He found her alone later that evening, down where the flats met the water, the tide pulling back to reveal the long silver stretch of mud and stone that Willa loved combing for Trotters tea. "I owe you an apology," Grant said, "for what I said about the article. You didn't deserve that. You were scared," Isla said simply. "I understood that eventually. Took me longer than it should have." "I was scared," he agreed. "Still am if I'm honest. Wasn't planning on any of this. Wasn't planning on you. Nobody plans on the good things," Isla said. "That's sort of the whole point of them." She looked out at the water, the light going long and gold across it, and for once she wasn't thinking about board meetings or quarterly numbers or her father's expectations. "I used to think success meant nobody could touch me. Turns out it just meant nobody could reach me. There's a difference. Took a 6-year-old with a bucket of crabs to teach me that." Grant laughed, quiet and real. "Gerald deserves a raise. Gerald deserves a great deal more than he's getting, frankly." They stood there while the tide kept pulling back, and neither one of them said anything else for a while, because for once there wasn't anything that needed fixing, explaining, or apologizing for. There was just the water, and the light, and the two of them standing in it together, which was, as it turned out, enough. The wedding happened the following autumn, on the wharf itself, because Grant refused to have it anywhere else, and Isla, when it came down to it, wouldn't have wanted anywhere else either. There were no corporate sponsors, no press releases, no photographers from the business pages, though Isla had made very sure of that herself. There were folding chairs borrowed from the community hall, and strings of lights run off the same generator Grant used for night repairs. And half the harbor showed up in their good jackets, smelling faintly of diesel, no matter how hard they'd scrubbed. Willa walked down the makeshift aisle first, scattering rose petals with the same fierce concentration she gave to crab watching, and stopped twice to make sure everyone was properly appreciating the job she was doing. Isla wore a simple dress, nothing like the tailored things she wore to board meetings, and when she reached Grant at the end of the wharf in front of the boat that had nearly been lost and wasn't, he thought she had never once, in all the photographs he'd since seen of her, looked anything close to this happy. Nobody had to tell her to smile, nobody had to ask. When the ceremony ended and Willa flung herself at the both of them at once, nearly knocking Isla off her borrowed heels, laughter went up and down the whole dock, the kind that carries out over water on a still evening, and doesn't quite ever stop echoing. Grant stood there with his daughter, and his wife, and the boat behind him and the whole battered, beautiful harbor around him, and understood, finally, that he hadn't been given someone to solve his life for him. He'd been given someone willing to stand in it with him, which was a different thing entirely, and the only thing, it turned out, he had actually needed all along.